folks, once again, we're expecting a full house. There'll be people coming from the community and other parts of the campus as well, so they'll be filtering in here. So if you could, please try to fill in all the seats towards the center so that the people arriving late don't disturb anybody else if they're trying to find a spot to sit. Also, please silence all your cell phones, close your laptops, and minimize any other distractions to the extent that it can. There are people sitting next to you, behind you, and please show some courtesy to them.
Again, there's still some, Nicole, come on down front. Any of you, come on down front. There's still some seats down here, the other people coming in.
Ladies, there's plenty of seats right here. Please don't block the aisleways or we'll have to have you arrested. We got lots of seats over here.
There's some more seats down front.
All right, well, we're almost at the 10 minutes past the event start time, which is when we usually begin. So let me welcome you first and foremost, friends, colleagues, students, members of the community. This is a special event hosted by the Institute for Political Studies. And certainly the context of this event doesn't need a whole lot of introduction. As I understand it, it's the buzz of the campus. People are talking about it in every single class. People are talking about it in the national media. And there's a robust national conversation taking place about social and racial injustice, the role of law enforcement and policing communities. And it's a good, healthy discussion that we want to engage here at Brookhaven College. But one of the reasons that we wanted to take this on was not to provide an outlet for, let's say, the rage or the unrest or the anger that comes out of these types of issues, but rather to provide an academic forum in which we can engage these issues intellectually and get past the emotional part of it. I'm sure everybody has some feelings on this case, one way or the other, but what we'd like to do is look at the broader implications of the shooting that took place in Sanford, Florida, and provide a context for what's going on in Sanford and in Florida and the country. And there's a lot of different ways to engage that. So before I do a short introduction of Florida politics and a little bit of Florida history, I'd like to introduce the panelists to provide a variety of, to help you understand why we're going to try to engage this topic from a wide variety of perspectives. So first we have Lieutenant John Klingensmith, the chief of the Brookhaven College Police Force. Next to him is Obed Manuel. He's a contributor to the Courier and a student here at Brookhaven College. Next is Hazel Carlos, professor in the English Communications Department. Next to her is Professor Mark Skorick, one of the political scientists / government teachers here. Next to him is Jared Scott, professor of philosophy. Next is Professor Greg Jacobs of sociology. And Greg, does that also cover criminal justice?
Yeah, somewhat.
And finally, Professor Bob Little, and he is also a member of the government / political science team. So please give them a hand and welcome them. My name is Ahad Hayuddin, more commonly known as Mr. Din to many of you. As you have probably heard me say on a number of occasions, and it's probably stale to the point where it's like, you know that one time at band camp? Well, what am I always saying in class? You know that one time in Florida? Well, that's where I'm from. I wasn't born there, but I lived there pretty much all my life, and I came here 5 short years ago from Central Florida. So, I've received my entire academic, and you could call it social training, you know, growing up. Going to high school, being a teenager, being a young adult. I've been in and around Central Florida for a long, long time, and I've seen a lot of things. At a slightly more sophisticated level than probably other people who are in my same age group, because I was studying political science and was developing a radar for taking a look at what's going on in the landscape around me. And I started to notice that there were some real serious problems in the state, so I moved. I did not want my kids growing up in Florida.
To Texas.
That having been said, let me explain a little bit about why I personally chose to change locations, and then provide some historical context for some of the things that I was starting to see, but I couldn't quite put my finger on. Well, let's just say that when I went into Macy's, I noticed that there was always this 25-year-old buff dude following me around, never asking me if I wanted help. And when I went to the beach and went into a surf store or some type of trinket store, there was always this little lady attached to my side, up and down every single aisle that I went to. And I was wondering, what is going on here? And apparently, this was something that other people were experiencing who may have the appearance of being a minority. I lived in a small town called Tarpon Springs, Florida, the Greek capital of America, if you haven't heard. And the Tarpon Springs police force have a reputation that you don't drive through that town while you're black. They called it DWB. And I started to experience this, where I'd get pulled over in Tarpon Springs for allegedly speeding when I wasn't, or not stopping fully and making a right turn, and so on and so forth. Little did the guys know that were harassing me that the chief of the Tarpon Springs Police Department is my wife's uncle, so none of those tickets ever stuck. But I learned an interesting lesson. Sometimes it's not what you know, but it's who you know. And that was kind of the way things worked in Central Florida. So, having said that, let's talk a little bit about some things that have happened there regarding the interactions between minorities and law enforcement. In the 1920s, 3 men went to vote in Oak Key, Florida, 30 miles from Sanford. Those men were lynched and killed. Several people who survived the lynching, besides those gentlemen who attempted to vote, fled. Many people fled to other parts of Florida to get out of Central Florida, where the Ku Klux Klan was very active. Some of these people settled in a little town called Rosewood. How many people have heard of the incident in Rosewood, Florida? There's a Ving Rhames movie on this topic, and let's just say that it ends violently. Moving on, 1951, civil rights worker Harry T. Moore and his wife are firebombed in their home on Christmas night. That was the night of their 25th anniversary. Both died from the injuries that they sustained. 1979, Arthur McDuffie, a Marine veteran, driving through Miami, is pulled over for speeding on his motorcycle. He is beaten so badly that he dies on the scene, and then the cops take the motorcycle and make skid marks and make it look like it was an accident. Those cops are all acquitted. 1982, Neville Johnson, 20-year-old county messenger, shot dead at a video game arcade by a Cuban-born police officer. 3 days later, they were rioting throughout the city of Miami. This is known as the Overtown riots. They have their own legend and lore, much like the Watts riots of Los Angeles. The officer was acquitted. 1989, Clement Anthony, shot dead, riding a motorcycle by a Cuban-born police officer. He too is acquitted of all charges in Orlando, which is, Sanford is part of the Orlando Metroplex. But let's talk about specifically the history of Sanford. Sanford, Florida is a plantation, citrus grove plantation historically, and the gentleman who settled in there came from New England, and his name was Henry Shelton Sanford. One of the things that Henry Shelton Sanford had proposed was that the slaves that were in this occupied property should be taken to Congo, part of the abolitionist movement. The effort to relocate the African American slaves from Central Florida to Congo never took place, but it was well discussed and documented in history. Probably the most troubling event that took place in my personal point of view was the next thing that happened in 1964, when Jackie Robinson was on the farm team for the Dodgers, and that farm team is in the Grapefruit League, which takes place in Central Florida. Jackie Robinson is threatened that there will be a lynch mob coming for him if he eats in the restaurants or stays in the hotels in Sanford. Jackie Robinson is then reallocated to a different farm team and sent to Daytona in order to protect his life. And Jackie Robinson later on went on to say that he seriously contemplated going back to the Negro Leagues and would not have gone down in history as the man who integrated baseball and had his jersey retired in every single baseball team in Major League Baseball. So those are some of the things that have happened in and around Sanford, Florida. Most troubling is the recent event in 2010 where a young man posted a video on YouTube of him punching a homeless man's face into a pole and then smashing his skull into the ground. This young man was not charged with any crimes, even though he was in possession of the video when the cops came to talk to him. Turns out this young man is the son of the lieutenant of the police force, and his grandfather is a circuit judge. Only after much media emphasis with replaying of the video, saying that there's been injustice, is he ultimately charged with a crime a month later. That may sound eerily familiar to you. On that note, let me step aside and allow the panelists to comment. Why don't we start down at the other end and work our way over?
Okay. First of all, I'd like to make the point that I think the tragedy in Florida really emphasizes the polarization today in American politics. You can certainly make a point that this is one of the most polarizing times of recent history. Also, again, keep in mind that it's been 12, 13, 14 years since the O.J. Simpson situation. It's been 20 years since Rodney King in L.A. Was beaten by the L.A. police. Again, both of these incidents emphasize the black-white divide. We saw this at the O.J. trial, where the blacks saw him overwhelmingly as innocent, the whites saw him overwhelmingly as guilty. And again, to me, this polarization emphasizes the seriousness, how this whole issue of race is right below the surface. It just takes something to cause people to respond. So to me, that would be the major thing that I would like to observe from the event that took place. As far as, again, comparing what Ahad had to say took place in Florida history, we could apply the same thing to Dallas. Dallas has a very racist history in the 1920s. The Ku Klux Klan was openly endorsed by the powers that be. We can find all sorts of incidents where lynchings took place, where people were not prosecuted. Dallas was one of the most racially divided cities until about the last 20 years. North Dallas, South Dallas divide. The Dallas Morning News, I want to compliment them, has really done a lot in trying to initiate a dialogue on this particular issue. For the last number of years, they've had what they call the North-South Bridge, where they said, look, we have these issues, let's try to get the dialogue going, let's try to diffuse some of these issues that divide us. Again, even though we've been very successful at reducing the segregation of the city of Dallas the last 20 years, it's still a very, very divided city. And a lot of the same issues take place, a lot of the same attitudes are there that were, say, 20 years ago. Also, again, keep in mind that this is much more than a black-white issue. There have been reports in the local news this semester of a conflict between blacks in South Dallas and an Indian shopkeeper in South Dallas, which has certainly had racial overtones. So again, we have to take a look at this from a much broader perspective than just a black-white situation. But also, I think this calls for or emphasizes the need for dialogue, the need to really sit down and try to get to some of these particular issues. So this would be my general impressions.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, first off, it's probably easier for me to talk 2 hours on this topic than 5 minutes, so I've kind of prepared some notes for myself. But let me say that first off, I think sociology and social science in general has a responsibility to provide empirical studies and evidence on which we can base good public policy around issues like racial profiling. So after listening to all the things that have been on the news lately, I've come up with 3 perspectives from a sociological point of view that I think reflect on this larger social issue of the Trayvon Martin issue. One is that we still have a very strong culture of racial thinking. Second is we have a culture of guns, which I think figures into this in a way. And third, and probably most important, I'll say, is our culture of fear. After listening to Mr. Cosby last week, I have to kind of agree and disagree with him on some things. I don't think we can solve anything by calling George Zimmerman a racist. I found out a long time ago you end the conversation pretty quickly when you start calling people racist. But I disagree with Bill that race isn't a central issue in our needed social dialogue about this event. We've yet to have a true social dialogue about race in this country. We've had several invitations, even recently, to start thinking and talking about this thing. We have made progress on race, and I think looking at the history of Dallas and Florida and other states, we have to acknowledge that we've moved a long way, particularly with this generation of young people today. We call Generation Mix, the first generation of people that actually socialize with people outside of their own ethnic group. So there is some hope on the forefront. But to deny that most Americans, I would say, feel safe in saying most Americans, still operate with a lot of racial thinking. What I mean by that is when the facts are unclear, we tend to attribute stereotypic character and motives to people. And in that instant, when you do that, that person actually becomes that stereotype for you. So racial profiling, I think, as part of the day-to-day accepted professional practices is undeniable social fact in America. People of color regularly experience this when they retail shop, as Ahad said, when you're filing for home improvement loan in a minority neighborhood, when you're surveying available rental property, when you're driving in certain neighborhoods. I used to make the joke, it's not much of a joke, but if you drive through Highland Park with a car with more than 3 colors of paint on it, and one of those colors happens to be Bondo, you're going to get stopped, right? You just don't belong there. So again, these are institutionalized practices. These aren't individual races so much as they're institutionalized practices that have come to be accepted in all these different fields. These are particularly hard to deal with. A particular book that I'm going to reference now is Mr. Cole's book in 2000 called No Equal Justice, where he provides us several nice empirical studies around racial profiling to make the point that it's undeniable. In this one particular study, they studied a stretch of highway in Florida, again, where 5% of the drivers were identifiable as minorities. 70% of all stops on that stretch were minorities, and 80% of all vehicle searches on that stretch of highway were minorities. So the idea that racial profiling's not real is something we need to get over. It is real. It's a huge problem. Arizona is trying to promote a bill to make it required to do racial profiling. So I also stumbled across, remembered and researched again the case of Yoshihiro Hattori in 92, Japanese exchange student residing in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, on his way to a Halloween party who went to the wrong house and was shot and killed. And that man was, there was no prosecution in that case either. So again, regarding stereotypes of young black men in America, I think that's a particular problem. And I go back to reference Richard Major's book called Cool Pose, which I think in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, when this book was published, he was describing a kind of hyper-segregated inner-city African-American males who have no material sorts of culture at hand, no material resources, no cultural resources either, that they would often develop this kind of very tough pose, violent, threatening pose, as a way to gain at least some kind of power of physical intimidation or type of respect for their potential for violence. And while this was probably pretty real in those hyper-segregated inner city areas in the early 90s, that symbolic image of a hoodie-wearing, swaggering, gang sign-throwing, finger on the trigger kind of violent pose, that was true at that time, I would argue, but since then, that image has gone pretty much mainstream in the 90s and early millennium. I'd say today that look, that stereotype, that kind of cool pose is really mainstream youth culture fashion and little else. But the power of that symbolic stereotype of young black men being really dangerous, that has lived on. That brings me to my last 2 points that I think are really important, and I want to deal with them together because I think they're inseparable. One is our culture of guns, which we've always had in America. But what I think is new here is the new culture of fear. Again, if you look at television shows today, it seems like we have a lot more gun shows than I can ever remember. I was watching Doomsday Preparers yesterday, I'm ashamed to say. But obviously there's something in our culture right now that's very fearful, and one of the answers to deal with that fear is guns. And I think while we've always had them, we've not had the combination of guns and fear. By the way, speaking of profiling, I also want to reference real quick, post 9/11, there was a Gallup poll that was conducted that said 60% of Americans favored special surveillance of persons of Arab descent, and a full 1/3 said that they should go to internment camps. So that energy is alive and well in America, kind of, and also the latest Pulitzer Prize winner from the Associated Press, who uncovered a story on New York City police surveilling Arabic people, Muslim people, for no other reason than just their religion and their ethnicity. So that stuff is there. Regarding handgun ownership, which I think is a really good sign of the increased fear in America, in 1950, about 1 in 10 households had a handgun in it. Our latest indication is that about 4 out of 10 do. The other factor that I think is a good measure of the fear factor in America has to do with the passage of concealed carry laws in America. There are only about 7 states that had concealed carry before 1990. So really the bulk of these states that pass laws, which all but one now has a right to carry concealed weapons, that happened in the period of late 80s and early 90s and through really mid 90s through 2000 when these states adopted these concealed carry laws. And now we have, I said, all but one state has those. So in conclusion, what I'd say is that it's not simply people doing what they want. There are sort of these invisible social forces that contribute significantly to events like this one that we're talking about today. I'm sad to say these things still happen every day among people of different ethnic groups. And I think it's really interesting that during the time period that we saw real violent crimes going down, we saw the fear factor going up. So again, my thinking is that we'll continue to have these kinds of problems and that they really are related to these larger social issues. Ready handguns, which we sure have those, so that's our culture of guns, in the hands of increasingly frightened people, sort of our new culture of fear post 9/11. And most of that fear really ratcheted up with the gangs and the crack epidemic in the late 80s. That's when our true high reported number of violent crimes were happening. I think after that, we can see the school shootings as something else that ratcheted up fear in Americans. And then obviously post 9/11 and so forth, it really brought it to the crescendo that it is now. So culture of guns, culture of fear, and then a culture of racial thinking is so quick to jump to those stereotypes. And those people really become that stereotype in that moment. So anyway, those would be the 3 things that I think are going on a larger sociological basis that contribute to this kind of problem. And until we start to have dialogues about all 3 of those things, I'm not sure that we'll see a whole lot of change.
Well, I come at this, I'm a philosophy instructor, so I come at this from that vantage point. And when these kinds of, well, any kind of issue comes up, my first instinct is to ask, well, what's underneath the surface? What assumptions are behind things? I recognize these issues that exist in our culture now, and my mind instantly says, well, what's behind them? Where do we want to be down the road? And what sort of changes need to be made to sort of affect some sort of change? This conversation we're having now seems to me, from what I've seen in different reports, largely to keep running at what I would say a more superficial level. We talk about racism, we talk about racial profiling. We can talk in this specific instance about issues of self-defense, stand your ground law, all of which I think are important conversations to have. I think it's a mistake just to have the attitude, let's just ignore it and act like it's not there. But for me, what I try to do is look underneath that and say, well, what's going on behind those issues that give rise to the conversation in the first place? I think we, and maybe not just American, but maybe humans, have a habit of trying to have our cake and eat it too. Trying to base our lives on values and beliefs that conflict with each other. And then we act shocked when there's a problem, or things don't quite fit. Let me give you a specific kind of instance relevant to this conversation today that I would think about. What I would want to ask people when they talk to me about trying to end this kind of culture we have, that try to bring about an end to racism, I would want to ask that individual, well, what is it you see society, what does it look like when it's over? Racism's gone, what is that to you? On the one hand, you could picture in your mind a world where race is treated much the same way that we treat eye color today, where I can notice there's a difference in color, but really it's insignificant for any of the decisions I make, or who I date, or who I hire, or who gets in. Certainly I'm not asked on any application what eye color I have. Is that what the end of racism looks like? Because if it is, that would seem to go against fundamental beliefs that we seem to have. People find a great deal of their identity in their race, their nationality, their religion, a great deal of pride in saying, well, I'm different. People hold up flags representing nationalities and go to marches, and we have Black History Month, and we have these things that celebrate the racial differences. So on the one hand, we seem to want to recognize differences, but on the other hand, we're saying, well, let's act like they're not there. Let's try to treat people exactly the same. And that seems to me to bring about this sort of fundamental conflict that results in a variety of issues that we don't like. And rather than acknowledge the problem, that there's racist judgments we make, that we do racially profile. Some of you have had me in classes, you know this. I was a student at a historically black school for 4 years. I'm about as pink as they get. I taught, I'm telling you, I taught at a historically black school for 3 years. I'm probably one of a handful of people that are white that can, at least to some degree, identify with the position of being followed around. I heard my share of names and was asked for ID a number of times to prove that I should be there. So I have maybe a different perspective than somebody else with my skin color might have. But for me, the issue is trying to look underneath the surface. Another issue that I immediately thought of when the Trayvon Martin case came to light, I started thinking and asking people who would talk to me about it, do we believe people have a right to defend themselves? If we do, regardless of the facts of this case, then what other implications follow from that? Should we allow people to prosecute if you are defending yourself, but they happen to be a different skin color? Or should that be built into the law as the standard ground law tries to incorporate that you can't be arrested unless there's some other evidence? Is that the kind of thing we want to have? Do we believe we have certain fundamental positions? So for me, it's not so much the details of this case and what Zimmerman did or didn't do, but in general, how do we want to view ourselves? Where do we see ourselves going in terms of a legacy down the road? Do we see ourselves ending the recognition of differences between the skin colors, between religions? And if so, that would have to change many other things that we seem to hold dear. If we want to hold those dear, then what implications does that have for the misjudgments people have based on those differences? And so I'm not saying I have an answer, but I'm saying to me the conversation needs to go underneath just the surface and the history, which is all a good thing to talk about. I'm more than happy to talk about that, but that's where my mind is trying to direct the conversation, and that's what I think about is if I want to be here down the road, wherever that is, then what changes need to be made to get there? And I think a lot of people aren't even asking that question of what do I think it looks like in the end? And so we don't know where the hell we're going. Just keep doing. And we have a lot of confusion, a lot of conflict. And I want to be proud of this, but I don't want other people to acknowledge it. We have parents telling their kids, I'm colorblind. The 4-year-old kid can look at people and say, what do you mean? I can see there's a difference. So what exactly does that mean? And so rather than just sort of ignore it or say, well, it doesn't mean anything, or I don't recognize a difference, we can acknowledge there's a difference at the same time as we explain that the difference is not a political or morally significant difference. Just like eye color. I can point to people and say brown eyes, blue eyes, green eyes, but that doesn't carry any other significance than that. So in one breath I can say there's a difference, but it's not a significant difference, legally, morally. So for me, that, as a philosopher, the emphasis in my mind is trying to dig underneath the main conversation that normally takes place to the more fundamental questions of who and what we are and what we want society to be.
I have a series of short questions. The Martin case raises a number of, I think, very interesting political, social, academic questions, and the way my mind works is really along those lines. I want to start off with taking a class with me for government. You know that I believe very firmly that the political history of the United States has evolved. It's developed around two central questions, two central problems in our history. Growth and civil rights have been the key issues. This is not truly a political science question. It's really a historical, sociological, philosophical question. But political science being what it is, that's where we begin. So as a political scientist, I'm really interested in the role of perceptions and images as variables that influence how we discuss political issues, how we view the world is key. How these perceptions, how these images influence the creation of institutions, institutions of legitimacy, institutions of justice, institutions of democracy. And so, truly, I believe, at least the research suggests, and has for many years, that in the context of U.S. politics, really in the context of any political system, perceptions have long replaced reality. And this is truly the philosophical part. Is reality about the Martin case? Is it relevant? Do the facts matter politically? Political power is consolidated. Political power is employed through the perpetuation of our images, through the perpetuation of stereotypes. It has been historically in the United States. It has been historically throughout many countries where racial and ethnic divisions have dominated political discourse. And so these images are reinforced by cultural constraints, by emotional constraints, how we feel about other groups, to the point that, quite frankly, they replace objective reality. So, let me put this in context that's a little different level. If you think I'm old, do you take seriously what I have to say about Deadmau5 and Tiesto? Does it matter to you that I have an opinion? You laugh about it, so clearly it's unusual. Do I have any influence on your thinking about these musicians? If you were told by one of your classmates that I hate Democrats, this is not true, but if you're told that, then do you, as a Democrat, interpret your grade in my course differently than you would if you were a Republican or an independent? If you believe that society is fundamentally unjust, then can there ever really be justice? It's not just a philosophical question. This has distinct political consequences. It's a political question to wonder whether objective reality ever matters in the face of perception. Images and perception drive political behavior. This is really my point. They're almost insurmountable in the realm of politics. And as political scientists, we've long struggled with describing the degree to which democracy, justice, legitimacy in government can ever be fully realized if the institutions themselves are perceived as inherently undemocratic, if they're perceived as inherently unjust. That is to say, is there a political counter? Is there any way to negate the effects of political images and perceptions, of racial stereotypes? The political question is, can anything be done? As an experiment, for example, I might suggest you try to tell an angry person, preferably someone that's really angry at you, why they should not be angry. Have a rational discourse with that person. Get back to me, tell me how that works out. Ultimately, we do hope that the institutions of a democracy, such as those that we have established in our government, under our Constitution, the branches of government, the processes in place, that these institutions of democracy do provide legitimacy, do provide justice for the long-term resolution of these problems. But there's clearly no quick fix to these problems that, as I mentioned from the beginning, lie at the heart of our political history. As an outside reference, I would strongly recommend that you take a moment to, not here, but later, Google currently President Obama's speech on race, then candidate Obama's speech on race from February of 2007 in Philadelphia, a speech that he gave less as a political candidate, more as a defense of his relationship with one Reverend Jeremiah Wright. In this speech, he doesn't talk about his political position at all. He talks about simply race, and many observers of racial politics in the United States believe that it is one of the most significant speeches on race in the modern era, at least since any of the work by Dr. Martin Luther King. So take a moment, look at that. He addresses the issue of race from a multitude of perspectives, and asks these same questions. What do we do? How do we surmount these obstacles that have long been pervasive in every aspect of our political life?
Well, as an English teacher and a teacher of literature, I decided that I would write my comments down so as not to forget anything or become too emotional. But as I think of Trayvon Martin, my mind goes back to another time in history, 1955, in Money, Mississippi, when a 14-year-old black boy from Chicago, visiting his uncle, went to the local store, bragged about a white classmate's picture in his wallet, and was dared by his cousin to whistle at the white woman who was walking out of the store. He whistled at her and ended up being dragged out of his uncle's home late that night, beaten to death, tied to a cotton gin, and drowned. I remember the photo of his face, a monstrous image that sent a warning to all black men to never look at a white woman. Rhodes Scholar, Penn Scholar, and Professor of Literature at Brown University, John Edgar Wideman, describes how he was haunted by the image of Emmett Till for years into his adulthood. He says, "I am a man, a first-time grandfather recently, yet a nightmare from my childhood still haunts my sleep. A monster chases me, some creature whose shape and face are so terrible for the nightmares to reveal. I can't escape. Run headlong down an unfamiliar street, duck into an alley, dart along shortcuts, dash in and out of all of the hiding places in my old neighborhood. The monster still lumbers behind me and also sits patient and hideous, waiting to seize me when I turn the next corner." Now keep in mind, this is a Rhodes Scholar. There have only been 2 African-American Rhodes Scholars in the history of this prestigious award. And yet, into his adulthood, into his grandfatherhood, he is still haunted by the image of Emmett Till. Trapped by the dream, I try to scream my way out. There is no way out, but I scream anyway. One scream of many. Screaming for mercy, screaming for the worst to happen, anything, just so the nightmare ends. Muscles of my throat constrict. I can't breathe. One last choked yell as the face of death looms closer. His description says something about the haunting reality of how he identified with Emmett Till, because he too was 14 at the time that Emmett Till was killed, and how the reality of Till's tragedy could be his own. Another image that came to mind was the morning after the killings at Jackson State University, where I taught and completed my undergraduate degree. That morning, I walked into the lobby of Alexander Hall, my former dorm for 4 years. A beautiful place, well manicured. But that day, as I climbed the stairs, I walked across glass and bloodstains caused by white policemen who decided to go out and shoot up some niggers. A young man had been shot the night before and killed. A quiet, handsome young man whose only crime was that he was going to visit his sister in Alexander Hall at the wrong time. Are these consequences? Could these incidents have happened at Millsaps, our neighboring white college? Close your eyes and imagine a baby boy, born to middle-class family, loved, exposed to art, music, literature, science, educated at the finest schools, associated with the best of organizations, confident, articulate, talented, Mr. Lakehill Prep. His resume, however, means nothing to our local police, who follow him home, up into his garage, gets out of the car, and asks the talented, gifted, articulate young man, "Can I help you?" He did not look as though he should live in such a house, and so he had to be stopped. Thank God, the confident, articulate, intelligent young man did not become insolent, cynical, or abusive, but instead said, "No, sir." A reference I had taught him to use when responding to adults. A black man's life is fragile, regardless of how much you have put into the raising of him. When he is on the streets, he is stereotyped, shunned, and often demonized. Trayvon's tragedy represents one more in a series of injustices, of suffering at the hand of those who, as Ralph Ellison says, see us as a phantom of their imaginations. And often our children's very existence is at the mercy of another's imagination. Trayvon was invisible. He had no unique profile. He represents all of the fear that one can muster, regardless of his resume.
I'm 20 years old. I'm from Oak Cliff, born in Mexico. So when I hear about cases, a case like this, it really resonates with me because I go to school in Farmers Branch. I spend a lot of time in North Dallas with friends sometimes. And I know what it's like to walk around and be looked at in a different form and fashion. The streets are nice. It's not the same back home. So like I said, when I hear a case like this, it really resonates with me. But that's beside the point for me. When I hear a case like this, when I hear a case that involves race, I try my best to steer away from that and look at at the other things that are below the surface, like we've said several times, because it kind of hurts to look at race as the defining factor in a case like this. So upon reading the New York Times, which I do mostly every day, I leave the op-ed page to the last because that's my favorite part. And on a Friday afternoon on my way back home, I was reading an article titled "The Gated Community-Minded Mentality" by Rich Benjamin. A funny name, I know. He's a journalist. From 2007 to 2009, he spent those 2 years living in gated communities, primarily white, around the nation. And he defined several of them. This is one of the first comments he makes, is the perverse, pervasive real estate speak I heard in these communities champions a bunker mentality, which in case you didn't catch that, it's kind of like a safeguard from the world, from what's around, from what's real. It's these communities, in a way, trying to protect themselves from the harsh realities that are racial profiling and crime and simply just the facts of life. And this article really struck home because I think he makes some valuable points that deal with how this case is not just about race. Yes, it's an extremely important matter in this case, but like Mr. Benjamin makes the point to say that the people who are minimizing this to race are missing other factors as well. Mr. Martin was profiled as a, quote, young, loitering, non-property owning, and poor. So what I believe is that this case touches on more than just race. It touches on the income gap in America. It touches on simply not being in the right place. Like I said, I've spent time in North Dallas. I know what it's like to be looked at different. I can imagine, after hearing the phone calls last night, then I spent about an hour listening to the 911 calls that were made that night, and I hear George Zimmerman's voice, and he's worried, he's preoccupied. He says, this guy looks suspicious. He's a young black man, and that, he's just looking at him. The kid doesn't belong, according to Zimmerman, and probably, maybe, allegedly, probably doesn't belong in the area. So he follows him, and after the police officer tells him not to follow him, and simply he profiles him, and now we are here today. Had he not followed him, had he not made assumptions about him possibly being poor, about him possibly not belonging in the area, there never would have been an alleged altercation. There never would have been a need to defend himself. There never would have been a need to fire a single shot. And I think that's really the question that's put in case. It's just personally for George Zimmerman, as why did he follow? Was he doing anything wrong? There's reports that he was speaking on the phone with his girlfriend, saying that he was on the phone with her. They were just walking. He was just walking with the famous bag of Skittles. And, but like I said, he was profiled. And it's not just about race, I feel, in this case. It's more, it touches on every aspect that is with being a poor American. If you're black or Hispanic and you're poor and you're hanging around in a more affluent area or an area like a gated community that is trying to protect itself from like what I said, like the harsh realities of life, then you are probably not going to be treated, you're definitely not going to be treated the same way. And that's just, to put it simply, it's unjust, it's unfair. Another point that I would like to make, simply about the media, and it's more of a suggestion, if you're closely following this case or loosely following it all, you can't just go to one source to get all your information. If you go to Fox News on your own, just to Fox News by itself, you're going to get them proclaiming that there's a witness who said that he saw George Zimmerman protecting himself. You go to CNN or any of the other kind of stations, you'll have them proclaiming they'll be questioning these shoot first, ask questions later. And I think that's another one of the points that one of the gentlemen made is just this culture of guns and this culture of fear. And that's what these laws are born from. These laws are born from the desire to protect oneself, and it's just not, maybe it's called for. I mean, someone attacks you, you're not just going to stand there and take it. But again, it's like the mentality of shooting first and asking questions later, and now someone's dead. And then just another case from last summer really resonates. It was the case of Troy Davis. In terms of just media coverage, he was already in jail. He had been convicted of murder purely on 13 eyewitness accounts, no evidence, no physical evidence. And then years later, 6 of the 13 witnesses retracted their statements, their testimony, which means that undoubtedly there's doubt in a case like that. But like in terms of media coverage, there's this desire to cover race. There's a desire to find faults in how police authorities and simply people deal with race. But like I said, just like a suggestion in terms of getting your information, you have to have an eclectic combination of where you go to for your news. Like I said, don't just go to Fox News, don't just go to CBS, don't just go to CNN, New York Times. You got to mix it up because you'll get a more full perspective of what is actually happening. And like in this case, we don't know what happened. There's one person on this planet who knows, and that's George Zimmerman. And whether or not he killed him in cold blood or he was defending himself, you know, we'll never know. He will stick to his guns because he doesn't want to go to jail. But like I said, we'll never know. I mean, like I said, perception. Does reality actually matter, or is perception everything?
Y'all hear me in the back? I like to speak loud, so. If you guys don't mind, I'd like to ask for a moment of silence for Trayvon and his family. He was a human being, and just because I'm wearing a badge, I know you guys see a cop, but we're all human beings. So if you don't mind, out of respect for him and his family, I'd ask for a moment of silence. Okay, thank you very much. I have stuff written down also, because this is an emotional subject for everybody. But my question that I have is a survey. I'd like to know how many of you have been stopped by a police officer. If you would, just raise your hand. Okay, good, cops are doing a job. now, keep your hand up if you received a citation. Keep your hand up if if your vehicle was searched. I won't ask you to keep your hand up if you're arrested, but okay. Proud of it. And I've been in law enforcement for 23 years, and I'd be a fool to say that racial profiling does not exist. There is a reason we have cameras in our vehicles. It is for protection of the officers and what we do, and people lie on us consistently. But also, police officers are human beings. There's good cops and there's bad cops. I'm not going to get a percentage. I know it's true. I've been around them a long time. And there's racism also in law enforcement, believe it or not. I go to chiefs meetings, I go to management schools, and they're predominantly white. I'd say they're 90% white. So we do have issues, but it has gotten better over the years. But now I want to get more involved specifically in this case, and more of a preventive lines. I want to talk about prevention. What can we do to prevent this in the future, in this specific case? So from a law enforcement perspective, what I believe led up to, I call it the murder of Trayvon Martin. Even though he's innocent until proven guilty, I'm just calling it what it is. I believe this is due to lack of training on Mr. Zimmerman's part and overreaction to what he perceived was a suspicious person. And you guys are calling that profiling, and I tend to agree with that, but that's my opinion. And also what I say here is I'm not just representing Brookhaven College Police Department. This is a lot of my personal opinions on this. You mind if I take this off? You mind if I stand up? Yeah. I apologize, I'm a little older now, my legs are killing me. So I did this is a college, so I got Webster's definition of what a neighborhood watch really is. A neighborhood watch surveillance program or are groups in which residents keep watch over one another's house, patrol the streets, and attempt to prevent crime. Now the key to this to me is watch, meaning observe, not action or confrontation. Like I said, it's a lack of training. Whoever the police liaison was for that neighborhood, it should be specific. You see a suspicious person, you call the police. You don't confront, you don't follow. And I'm going to get to both sides of it at the end of this. All right? And what I did, I printed out what neighborhood watch guidelines are. So you guys are familiar. You have to know what neighborhood watch is to know what Zimmerman was thinking. So let's get a little more personal on this. Number one, form a small committee made up of individual neighbors to determine if an interest is there and if a watch is needed. Obviously, they had a watch program, so it was needed. Contact the local police department to understand the criminal activity in the community. Ask the police liaison to attend the meeting. It is essential to have a police involved in a watch to share information and provide support and training. Number three, select a date, time, and place of the first meeting. Print flyers and deliver door to door a week ahead of time. Number four, establish the neighborhood's needs and interests at the meeting. Explain to the members what can be done to reduce crime and how they can contribute to the watch group. Number five, elect the chairman to head the group and be in charge of setting up activities. The chairman should be well organized and have the time to dedicate to the group. Number six, select block captains. If I'm not mistaken, Mr. Zimmerman was a block captain, so he should have a little more training. Number seven, set up training for the chairman and block captains with a police liaison. In my opinion, training can prevent future tragedies. And number eight, establish a monthly meeting time and be sure to have the meetings in place large enough to hold all who wish to attend. Number nine and last, keep the watch connected by holding social gatherings and events. The watch needs to become a close-knit community. Group activities will keep the members interested and engaged. So hopefully, in Zimmerman's case, they were following all these, but apparently something went terribly wrong. So in essence, Crime Watch calls the police if they observe a suspicious person. They are not police and they're not vigilantes. In my opinion, I think maybe he got a little overzealous. Maybe he was a cop wannabe. I don't know. I don't know what transpired and really don't know him or his side of the story. But based on what I know in this case, I say all the facts are still not in. I've put down 5 things that really stuck out for me. The initial police officers. Police must go with evidence they have for each case. They had to decide if there was enough evidence to charge Zimmerman with murder, and apparently they chose not to initially charge him. Mr. Zimmerman, number 2, Mr. Zimmerman, as neighborhood watch commander, should have just phoned in a suspicious person and left it at that. He's the eyes and ears. In other words, he'd call in and say, I got him at this location, he's headed that way. I'm done, that's it for me. It's almost like a security guard, you're the eyes and ears. Number 3, Mr. Zimmerman should have not followed Trayvon. Again, I think you would all agree with that one. Number 4, this is speculation. It said in the media that Mr. Crimmon had a criminal history, and if he was a prior felon, he should have never been carrying a weapon, even with a concealed handgun license. And I don't know, I know everybody in Texas has the right to bear arms, and y'all, probably 90% of you agree with that. In my professional opinion, this is just me, I believe only police officers, military, and hunters should have weapons. There's just too much that can go wrong. It's Murphy's Law. Whatever can go wrong will go wrong. In an emotional situation, you have a weapon, and you get alcohol involved, it's even worse than that. So. And number 5, unfortunately, we only have Zimmerman's side of the story, and the police initially went with self-defense claims. And my last thing I wanted to touch on, and if I'm talking too long, just cut me off. I'm glad you got a Florida, by the way. I got a Florida statute here. It's 776.012, and I'd like to read part of this to you. It says, a person is justified in using deadly force and does not have a duty to retreat if he or she reasonably believes that such force is necessary to prevent imminent death or great bodily harm to himself or herself or another, or to prevent imminent commission of a forcible felony. That being said, like this gentleman said, we don't know the whole side of the story, but everything I heard and everything I've watched, it doesn't look good for Mr. Zimmerman, in my opinion. That's just my opinion. So my message of prevention would be training, more training, because you react how you train. And that's all I have.
Okay, we ran a little over time. I was going to invite each panelist to make a final comment, but perhaps we'll allow that to emerge through the question and answer portion of this event. If you have a question that you would like to pose to the panelists based on their professional or personal experience and the comments that they've made today, please come down here to the lower right part of the room. We have a microphone set up here so that the videographer can capture you, because if this microphone's traveling around the room, basically your head's going to be in the back of the camera. So again, invite anybody who would like to pose a question to the panel to come on down. Just form a line right here, and we'll try to get as many questions as we can. We have about 15 minutes remaining in the session.
To the sociology professor, what kind of new fears, you touched on fears with handguns, and I was wondering what kind of new fears do we have now that we may not have had before, because we tend to have guns since forever.
Yeah, well, as I said, I think guns have been around. That's really, to me, not as big a problem. You could argue that handguns are different from long guns, and that, you know, they're concealable, and you treat people different when they walk up with a shotgun in their hands. You're probably not going to agitate them. Anyway, that aside, I think that really going back to the late 80s with the gangs, crack epidemic, the school shootings, of course, 9/11, we've ratcheted that fear factor up. I have an 84-year-old father, and by the way, there's another thing, in symbolic interaction, one of our major theories, we say you construct your reality from the people you hang out with and the things you talk about. Media is a big part of that, and I would say media has contributed significantly to our fear factor. If you look at the kinds of shows on television, my 84-year-old father watches cop shows and Fox News and all this kind of stuff. And I think he believes, we say a physician sees everybody as potentially ill. I think if you're a TV watcher today, you see everybody as potentially criminal, because there's just so much of that in the airways. So I would think that's another part of it. But yeah, I think we've just lived through it. And we had a lot of help from our government, by the way, in terms of feeling fearful about certain groups of people and so forth. I just think we're more afraid than we've been in a really long time in this country.
I think that may also attribute to how easy it is to acquire a handgun.
Well, like I say, the concealed carry, as a measure of that fear, I think you can see that the concealed carry laws were passed, the number of people that are involved in that now. I think all that's just another indication of this higher level of fear that we have of one another.
Also, let me say, I think the economy contributes a lot to that too. Anytime you take a look at economic downturns, increase in fear, just uncertainty causes a lot of reaction by people.
This question's for everybody on the panel, really. Do you feel as though, like in this case specifically, that the media needs to be held more responsible for how much of an issue they tend to make race sometimes?
I'd say race is an issue. It's probably the big issue that we don't acknowledge. Race is probably, in America historically and yet, one of the most powerful indications of your social identity.
Right.
So, I wouldn't say it's so much that. I think media around issues of violence, like I said, at the same time that actual violent crimes have been going down, and I think it's partly because of media, our fears are going up. So I think that's something that we have to hold media accountable for in some way.
I think one of the things that you have to understand about the media is that it's entertainment too. So if you're watching CNN 24-hour news cycle, you're going to get the same stories with the same kind of blast on the TV. During the 9/11, transmissions, they kept replaying attacks, and you ask yourself, was that healthy or was that unhealthy? In the sense of reinforcing fear and things like that. But that's one of the things you have to keep in mind, is that it's entertainment at the same time if you're watching it on TV. And also, like you said, held accountable. It's on the individual too. It's where, like I said, where you go and how much you want to get into it. And that's up to you. And like I said, get an eclectic combination of things, because it'll help you get better inside us.
Well, I mean, I'll specifically bring it up when it came out that the NBC, I guess, producer or editor had actually altered the 911 tape and actually taken out the fact that it was the 911 dispatcher that asked George Zimmerman if Trayvon Martin was black. They actually edited that out and just took it to George Zimmerman saying, yes, he's black. In your opinion, is that right? Should they be held accountable for the fact that they falsified evidence, essentially?
Well, I don't think it's falsified. I think, like I said, it's just it's the effect that they wanted to have. They want to hear Zimmerman say he was black.
Right.
They don't want you to hear the police officer say. They don't want to hear you They don't want you to hear the police officer ask, "Was he black?"
Right.
Was he black?
Right.
And it was to bring up, more tension in the nation and everything. But do they need to be held to a certain standard?
I would think that the answer to that question is clearly in any instance where the media creates information, we have to acknowledge a number of things. Number one, as was just mentioned, the media is primarily, it is no longer an outlet for information. It is an outlet for entertainment and the capturing of a specific population with the long-term goal of selling ad space. Okay, so they'll do that however they can. Second, we also have to bear in mind that the media no longer serves the function for which it was, we believe, originally created. That is to be a watch on government. That is, we used to refer to it as a public service, and you don't hear about that anymore. And it's a longer discussion to have about why that has happened. But yes.
Keep in mind, Dan Rather lost his job with CBS News a number of years ago for mixing up the facts, as he said. But, statements like were stated about the dispatcher asking if Trayvon was black should certainly be reported, and if that was deleted, that person should certainly be held accountable.
Thank you.
Hi. I wanted to ask, and this is for anyone, how can we affect institutional racism without significant changes of popular media, especially when really we're enculturating children? I'm glad people are talking about the media. It starts in the home, and we can't really, this is emblematic of a greater issue, greater philosophical and cultural issue. Children are being engendered, and we talk about celebration of diversity, and you touched on celebration of diversity and being colorblind, but we can't affect those changes until we begin, children are not born, they are born observational, not racist. Can you talk a little bit about your feelings about that, anyone?
I wanted to say just real quick, and this is something I've written down as I was listening to other people speak. One of the central questions is whether this kind of structured inequality, whether it's race, class, or gender, in all three of those categories, we disadvantage certain groups structurally. Whether those are sort of temporary, disequilibriums in our society, and we're slowly working our way back to resolving them, or in fact, if these are structural and constitutional elements of our society, in a highly competitive capitalist society, maybe this is just structured into our whole society. So I think that's a real critical question too.
We need to keep in mind that race is an artificial construct designed to empower one group and disenfranchise another. In the early years when race was established, professors at Harvard University wrote treatises on the size of your lips was determined the size of your brain, okay? We laugh at that today, but those were serious scholars establishing the stereotypical explanations or definitions of what constituted one group or one race versus another. So when you ask the question of race and is it central and so forth, it will remain central until we decide otherwise. And all of you scholars sitting in here today will determine that. You will determine it by what you study or what you refuse to study, what you refuse to explore. I teach literature, and for a very long time, even when I was in graduate school, I had to select African American writers because they were not in the canon. And in order for me to study them in graduate school, I had to write about them and force my professors to give me comments on Richard Wright and Ralph Ellison and all the great authors. So as scholars, you have to decide that you want the whole story, that you want all the information, that you want all the history, all the literature, all the art, all the music. You don't want to leave here without knowing who Jacob Lawrence is. How dare you walk out of an art class and not know Jacob Lawrence? Do you see what I'm saying? You have to have the whole story. And I tell my students all the time, the most dangerous individual in the world is the one who has the whole story, because you cannot be exploited. And that's what you pass on to your children.
Dr. Jared Scott. What do you think should or could be done against the eye for an eye mentality that the Black Panthers have in Florida when they put a hit out against Zimmerman?
What can be done?
Good luck.
Well, maybe it'll go some way to answer that. I was going to comment on what was just said. I think race is a very artificial construct we make, and we try to label people predominantly by skin because it's such an easy, observable characteristic. If we all had exactly the same skin tone, it would be something else. And this gets to what I was saying earlier. We've got to ask like the more fundamental question about who and what we are, just biologically, psychologically. We are built to notice differences. And if there's not an easy difference to note, we'll find something that's not so easy to note and make that the difference. So what can be done about any particular group that has such a strong opinion based on some constructed concept like this? I don't think there's anything, I mean, there's certainly legal options. We could address specifically that group. For me, the question is, what are we doing in society to get people away from thinking that way and try to educate people that race is a construct, that shouldn't be some limitation in how you see somebody, whether it's an author or any other subject. That just shouldn't be. So it's a very early education question for me. I think that's we need to change, for example, forcing schools to have people relate with other groups, or at least encourage, maybe not force is the good word, but encouraging more mixing. You go to any elementary school, middle school, high school, you're going to see people segregating themselves. And if they're all the same skin color, they're going to segregate by other differences. There's going to be by size, by income, they'll find something.
I think it's harder to do that on an individual level. I think that over time, individuals, racist will not be such a problem. I think the problem is this institutionalized practices. And that's something we can do something about with public policy. We can look at police procedures. We can look at passing laws to help to change how bankers loan money in certain neighborhoods. We can change these institutional kinds of racism.
Okay, next question. And remember that Gandhi said an eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind.
The officer had mentioned that Zimmerman had a previous felony that he wasn't charged for, and I was just wondering what you thought about the fact that his father was a judge, and how do you think corruption plays into that role, and the fact that he had a gun was probably had something to do with how his father is a judge.
Yeah, I'd like to cop out of that one. No, it's hard to speculate on something like that. We don't know all the details of that, but definitely it could play a part in not being charged. That's just speculation on my part, but there's definitely stuff that goes on we don't know about.
My question is for everyone on the panel. While the Trayvon Martin case was all over the media, another case in California happened where a 32-year-old mother was found by her daughter after having been beaten with a tire iron with a note laying next to her that said, "Go back to your own country, you're a terrorist." The family was Muslim, and they were from Iran, if I'm not mistaken, but The father had been working for the U.S. government to teach the soldiers going over there how to behave culturally so that they blended in and did not offend the people who lived in the countries they were going to. So how come something like that, where it was very clearly racially motivated, there's not much controversy, they left a note saying go back to your own country, and her 17-year-old daughter found her and she was beaten brutally, how does that not get half as much coverage as something like the Trayvon Martin case? How is that not as important to the media?
It's not. Just to put it on a local perspective, one of the stories I always tell in my classes, I had a student from India a number of years ago in a class here at Brookhaven who went over here to Beltline and was beaten up. It was the time of when we first invaded Iraq. And some people in the bar called him a towelhead, called him all sorts of derogatory terms, and beat the dickens out of him. He was in the hospital for 2 weeks. He was sent a card and everything. And come to find out, the kid was from India. He was not Muslim, he was Hindu. It was complete misinformation, as I think your story implies here. And just to let you know that that same sort of thing can happen locally. It's something that should have gotten a lot of attention. And there's one last thing I want to say to show you how local this is. This is yesterday's paper. For those of you who know, I use paper every day in class. Right here in the front page of yesterday's paper, it talks about the issue. The headline is "Immigration Tension Replaced by a Gentler Tone," but the issue of immigration, race, etc., right here in Farmers Branch in our own backyard, so it's about as local as it can get.
Okay, next
Well,
question.
and I want to point out, as has been said, the media is trying to get viewership. They'll put on what they think people want to hear, and that is plain and simple.
Let me say, this is about people that are different. It can be race, ethnicity, it can be your sexual orientation. I mean, we have hate crimes. At the same time that violent crimes are going down, the crimes that are coming up are hate crimes. So they're hate. Anybody who's different from the mainstream can be targeted for this kind of stuff.
But the media is going to put on what they think you're going to be tuning into. That's the point. So,
Can I address the hate crimes? The reason the hate crime stats are coming up because they actually have to report them now also. So.
Better reporting.
Next question.
Well, before we go on these, I really want to give a little commentary on actually being African American and dealing with some of the issues in the public. Pretty much how I dress is how I dress everywhere I go. But the issue of racial profiling is pretty prevalent. I don't want people to think that it's always the hoodie that gets that type of reception. And for the panel, the question I have is, what can we do as students and as professors in our university to get past racial divides? We don't really talk about it. We just, until we get in a situation like this.
We talk about it a lot in sociology. It's a pretty major focus for us, and the idea of the constructed nature of race and how we did that really in a colonial context. We had to legitimize when we were taking the world away from people of color, so we created this idea of race.
This question is kind of for everyone. How do you, growing up, I went to middle school in Garland that I was predominantly one of the only white kids at that school. You know, there was others, but it was predominantly me. I was the only one on the football team, the only one on the basketball team, and so on. How do you go about being the white person that is looked at differently? Like the young man said, he said that you were, it might not necessarily be your race or color, that it could be profiled. You're not in the right place. I went through that every day. I was, you know, looked at differently, but I was just wondering how it's not also just the whites looking down at the African Americans or so on and so on. It goes both ways sometimes.
no, at the school I went to, I was told, I played in high school, I played quarterback on the football team, and was told not to even try out because the alumni wouldn't accept, if they had one white person on the team, that being the quarterback. That would send the wrong message, so just don't do it. I certainly understand where you're coming from. How I managed my situation was just kept going about my business and showing people I was the same as everybody else. And over some time, people started to realize in their interactions with me in class, outside class, he likes the same things I do, hangs out at the same places I do, and that's what I'm saying about the early education. If we have some way to help promote people doing things together, they lose that sort of the feeling that they're different in a meaningful sort of way. They can see a difference and say it doesn't mean anything.
This is for whoever has an opinion. When I look at America, I see an absence of culture, a loss of heritage. Do you guys think that this absence of culture is being filled in with the fear and the hate and other things because of the mix of cultures in America?
What, I'd ask you to be a little bit more precise. What do you mean by an absence of culture? What does that mean?
Like, say for instance me, I'm German Irish,
Okay.
yet I know absolutely nothing about my heritage.
Like ethnic identity.
Yeah.
And so you believe that as you look, as you survey the country, that is less of a dominant feature than it might have been otherwise?
I think that some cultures are stronger than others, that you still hold value, but I think for the most part, like, my family's not connected with the rest of my family, and I think that that's the case in a lot of families, and then,
You mean like European immigrants?
yeah.
Do you
it's
mean,
just-
well, I think you have to
Everybody's ethnic, right?
Yeah.
Right, we're all immigrants.
You have to look at like which like you're saying, like maybe you're referencing.
Well, we
maybe
celebrate, like.
Yeah, maybe you didn't want to say, yeah, it's like you celebrate Hispanic culture, or you
Celebrate.
because I think it's probably just like a historical thing, really. These are the newer, I don't know, might be wrong, might be dead wrong, but it seems to me like these are the newer cultures. It's like, I don't know what generation you are from, like you said, German Irish, that's probably been centuries, probably, for your lineage. I mean, that's just history, probably.
But my question is not knowing about, or not having that pride and stuff like that, is that being filled in with fear? Is that being the driving force behind these cultural differences? Do you
I can't see how it couldn't help to people start owning their ethnicity. It shouldn't help that
Because
possibly.
like if we're gonna steer away from our thing, there's still pieces that are really unfit.
Right. It seems to me, this is what I said at the beginning, if people, I mean, if I don't know my heritage, don't even tell you where my mother was born. I grew up in an environment where that didn't seem to be relevant to me. It didn't help me pass this test or the next day. So if I run into somebody who's all about their ethnic heritage, whatever that is, they are presenting a difference to me. They're saying, I'm this, you're not. And that was what I was talking about before. We have this situation where we want to promote that kind of pride and say, okay, good for you, but that also clearly marks a difference. Whereas we have this history of, Irish at one time was not a good thing to be. And now...
They drink too much and they fight.
Now, white just covers Irish, Greek, Polish. At one time that was a